when Kemi is now resetting perhaps the failures, or tried to reset the failures of Conservative past, even though there were people were trying to make comparisons between her and Margaret Thatcher being the 100th anniversary of her birthday, as you were saying earlier on, there was lots of comparisons there. She dominated conference as well. Do you see any similarity between Kemi and Margaret Thatcher, or Kemi and Disraeli in that sense?
Well, Kemmy, like Disraeli, is a complete outsider. You know, something that hasn't, the like of which really hasn't been seen in our political system before. Much more of an outsider than Rishi Sunak, who is a product of Winchester, and if you didn't look at him, you would take him for English. Kemi really is a genuine oddity. It may be that will work to her advantage. However, unlike Disraeli, Kemi is not a person, I think, who's read very much. She was an engineer by training. She always comes across to me as somebody. Again, I could be very wrong, but I don't know her. One just has to form impressions from how one sees people and listens to them without much intellectual depth. I think she's curious. I think she's quite quick. I think there's a certain boldness about her, all of which are qualities that I like. But the extraordinary thing about Disraeli, he is, of course, I think I'm right, I must be right in this, he's the only 19th century prime minister who does not go to university, does not go to Oxford and Cambridge. But what he did was to embark on a spectacular scheme of reading. He'd read everything and infinitely more than even his greatest contemporaries at Oxbridge. He'd also done something extraordinary for a man of his age and background. He'd travelled Europe and penetrated into the Middle East and so on in a way which I don't think none of our previous leaders have ever done. So he had a depth and width of experience which was quite extraordinary. We've got to hope, perhaps, that something of Kemi's extraordinary background in Nigeria might help. But I wonder about that because, of course, Nigeria itself is a politics of bitter hatreds, of sectarianism, and so on. Now there are aspects, I'm afraid, of bitter hatreds and sectarianism that immigration has imported into Britain. But one hopes we don't have the methods which were used to deal with them in Nigeria, which involved bloody civil war. We don't want that. And again, the comparison with Thatcher, you see, this comparison, which has haunted the Tory party ever since its matricide in the slaughter of Thatcher, the kind of thing which the dreadful Heseltine, who's just came out of the woodwork at the conference, looking quite terrifyingly like a filmic vampire. I mean, the hair swept back, the face shrunken, quite terrifying figure. But the matricide of Thatcher, of course, seared itself into the Conservative Party. But we draw the wrong lesson. Thatcher herself was entirely about challenging one aspect of the post-war settlement. It was the economic aspect of it. In other words, it was replacing Keynesian economics with free market economics, with Milton Friedman, Friedman economics with monetarism, bringing the rampant inflation, the thing that's most destructive about modern government since the 1920s, the destructive inflation, as it turned out, temporarily under control. But the problem was, of course, that Blair and Brown and Mandelson, and you will remember, we now know he's not called Mandy. We know from the famous exchange with Epstein that he's called Petey. Petey, you may remember, pronounced himself happy with people being filthy rich. And famously, New Labour, in economic terms, at least to begin with, continued the Thatcher financial settlement. But the point is, what Labour did, what Blair did, was something much more fundamental. He transformed the way we were governed. He twisted our law. When Blair said, you remember he talked about cool Britannia, about Britain being a new country. We all laughed our heads off. Britain, 800, well, England, 800 years old in terms of a continuous constitution going back to Magna Carta, in terms of a country, name it, 1200 years old or whatever it is, new country. Ha, ha, ha. But you know what, Charlie? Blair really did make us a new country. He imposed a new constitutional settlement that was radically different, and indeed, in many ways, the inverse of the old, because it turned us inside out. The old Britain was a sovereign country in which the job of Parliament was to legislate for the British and in the interests of the British. What the Blairite constitutional settlement did was to say, we owe a duty to the rest of the world. That the famous phrase of Obama, "You take the back seat," actually applied to our domestic government, as we see. In other words, it actually turned the native British people into second-class citizens in their own country. It's astonishing. And he also, of course, transformed the population by his immigration policies. That famous phrase of Andrew Nether, isn't it? That he was determined to rub our noses in diversity. Now, that means that you need a much more ambitious understanding of what has to be done. With Margaret, it was relatively straightforward. Geoffrey Howe's budget, sort out interest rates, take on, with careful preparation, the National Union of Mine Workers. What we're talking about, what needs to be done, and what I think Kemi has only begun to have a glimmering understanding of, is there's a vast task of, I call it repeal, I call it the Great Repeal. You need to do, and so the model here now isn't Margaret Thatcher. There is a model. Interestingly enough, it is on the other side of the Atlantic. It's Donald Trump. Now, there are two lessons there. The first is the amount of preparation that went into Trump Mark II. The fact you had really America First, you had the Heritage Institute working on the Project 2025, the enormous amount of legislative preparation, the drafting of documents, discovering what you had to do to repeal, to modify, and so on, carried out by Stephen Miller. Any incoming government that wants to regain control of Britain will have to do that hard, nitty-gritty work. It's an enormous undertaking. And we know again that Thatcher, again, I said Thatcher's task was comparatively simple, but you've been involved in the think tank world yourself. An entire pairing of think tanks, the old think tank, the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, and the new think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, worked for 5 years in preparing the way for Thatcher. And this is something, again, that I don't see any real sign of in the Conservative Party at the moment, that there has to be this immensely hard preparation for power. It was, again, something that was conspicuously lacking in 2010. Of course, they were with the Liberals, but as David Cameron made clear, he wanted a Conservative Party where Liberals would be happy. So there was never any real sense of a radical change of direction in 2010, or at any point subsequently, apart from Liz Truss. Any government that comes in after Keir Starmer, there's going to have to be a major change of direction. It's clear the Blairite settlement is dead. The Blairite settlement is dead constitutionally because not even Starmer, with his huge majority, can make it work. I mean, he's talking about, the civil service, like Tony Blair, being a rod on his back. He is realizing that the structures of English nature and so on don't allow you actually to carry out the necessary economic development. He's realizing that the Office of Budget Responsibility acts as a perpetual secretary. The whole machinery doesn't work. But he, of course, because he's part of that machinery, and particularly as he appointed somebody like Lord Hermer as Attorney General, who's absolutely signed up to the whole of this. The machine is sort of fighting itself, and they are not capable of the necessary fundamental rethink. Any incoming government that's going to change that will have to have done the work. Again, is reform capable of doing